Welcome to the JMC True Crime channel. Thank you so much for joining me. Today's video surrounds the egregious acts of a man who was thought to be anything but. This man was cherished, he was adored, and he was well sought after. What happens when perceived attractiveness is confused for trustworthiness, for likability? I'll give you the answer. In this case, nothing good. So, without further ado, strap in and let's get stuck in. On the 24th of November 1946, a baby boy was born to Eleanor Louise Cowell in Burlington, Vermont. Burlington is the largest city in Vermont, and it is located just 45 miles south of the US-Canadian border. Eleanor was referred to by her middle name Louise, and so that's exactly how I'll be addressing her in today's video. So, Louise had been unwed at the time of her son's birth, and so to protect him from the social stigma that accompanied having been born outside of wedlock, her parents raised him, his grandparents. And don't forget, we are talking about the 1940s here, so it was not considered to be socially acceptable to have an illegitimate child. It was, you could argue, equivalent to having a scarlet A seared into your chest. Whilst this decision was made to protect the young boy, it did end up hurting him because a lot of lies were told. Family, friends, everyone around him told him that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his older sister. Inevitably, the truth would come out, and when it did, it wasn't pretty. The young boy would grow to have endless amounts of resentment for his family, for completely altering his worldview, and for not really getting to know where he came from. Sure, his family was still his family, but the roles that they assumed were not accurate. This young boy's name was Theodore Robert Cowell, but as he grew, he would come to be known under several different names. There is one in particular that sticks out. There is one in particular that I think we as a nation may never be privileged enough to forget. How BUNDY-ful. Nice little pun for you there. There were many instances of concerning behaviour from Theodore when he was a child. For example, Louise's younger sister Julia, therefore Theodore's aunt, once recalled waking up from a nap only to find herself surrounded by knives from the kitchen, and a 3-year-old Theodore was standing by her bed, smiling. Creepy. Theodore's childhood neighbour Sandy called him a bully. She said that he liked to terrify people, that he liked to inflict pain and suffering and fear. And this is when he was only a child. In 1950, Louise moved she and Theodore to Tacoma, Washington, where her Uncle Jack lived, and it was there where she met and married her husband. In 1951, they were wed. He was a hospital cook in a Methodist church, and his name was John. John Culpeper Bundy. John would legally adopt Theodore, who was now known as Ted, therefore making his name Ted Bundy. Louise and Johnny would go on to have 4 biological children together, and although Johnny always wanted a close relationship with Ted, it never happened because Ted had no respect for him. He would always say that Johnny wasn't his real father. He would say Johnny wasn't very bright and didn't make much money. He didn't think that Johnny was a real man. As a student in high school, Ted was very intelligent. He did very well, but socially, he wasn't the most approachable. He struggled with making friends. He enjoyed peeping into people's windows and would often steal things and felt no remorse. In 1965, Ted graduated from high school and attended the University of Puget Sound before he transferred to the University of Washington 1 year later. In 1967, when Ted was 21, he met and became involved romantically with a classmate named Diane Edwards. Now, Diane was everything to Ted. She was a physical representation of everything he desired: class, influence, money. Three things he didn't have, but she did. But the relationship wasn't meant to last. And this is a good thing for Diane's sake. She grew frustrated with his immaturity and lack of ambition, so she broke up with him. And this devastated Ted. As a response to his heartbreak, Ted traveled to Colorado, then Arkansas, then Philadelphia. He visited relatives, and he even enrolled in a semester at Temple University. It is hypothesized that during this period in 1969, Ted visited the birth records office in Burlington, which confirmed his true parentage. This is just a theory, however, and so I cannot confirm this with absolute certainty. Now, before we move on, I do just want to note that Diane, Ted's first significant relationship, was an attractive girl with long and dark hair. This may sound innocuous now, but her physical attributes will be a common denominator in Ted's later victims. By the fall of that same year, Ted was back in Washington, and it was there where he met Liz Kendall. Liz was a single mother from Ogden, Utah, and she worked as a secretary at the UW School of Medicine. She had a 3-year-old daughter called Molly, and Ted would become quite the father figure to Molly. Recalling her experiences with him as an adult, Molly would later say that Ted was both physically and sexually abusive towards her. He would hit her in the face, he would knock her down, he would touch her sexually but disguise it either as an accident or just playing a game. Ted was disgusting, needless to say. In the middle of the 1970s, so Ted was about 6 months into his relationship with Liz, he was feeling rejuvenated and ready to focus, and so he re-enrolled at the University of Washington. However, this time his major was psychology. He was held in high regard and even became an honor student. An honor student is a student recognized for achieving high grades, therefore being deemed academically excellent, and Ted was. In 1971, he took a job at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center, and his colleagues thought nothing but the best of him. They thought he was kind and empathetic. There were no red flags from what they could recall. And as you can imagine, this allowed Ted to just blend in with the crowd. He didn't stick out. Or if he did, it was only in positive ways. Ted graduated from the University of Washington in 1972, and in early 1973, despite less than impressive LSAT scores, Ted was still accepted into the law schools for University of Puget Sound and the University of Utah. The LSAT is the law school admission test, and it is known to be extremely difficult. Despite that, though, I was quite shocked to learn that Ted's scores weren't that great, because, as I said earlier in this video, he was known to be extremely intelligent. Nevertheless, his mediocre scores really didn't hurt him. Thankfully, he still had strong letters of recommendations from his psychology professors, and those recommendations are what helped to secure his spot in law school. Okay, so you all will remember Diane Edwards. I mentioned her earlier in the video. She was Ted's dream girl. She had money, she had influence. She was just part of the upper class. But she dumped Ted and broke his heart. Good for you, Diane. High five. Anyway, whilst on a trip to California in the summer of 1973, Ted and Diane rekindled their romantic relationship. She was incredibly impressed by the kind of person he had become. Don't forget they had broken up 5 years prior, and within that time, Ted was on the up and up. He was on the cusp of a significant legal career, and just seemed to be much more mature than he was back when they had been together initially. Ted continued to date both Liz Kendall, remember her, the single mother from Ogden, Utah, and Diane Edwards, this seemingly unattainable girl who he had recently reconciled with. Ted the two-timer. If only this had been the worst of his infractions, then, well, happy days, to be honest. Sadly, the next few days, weeks, months, years that I'm going to cover are not so happy. So let's continue. In the fall of 1973, Ted officially joined University of Puget Sound Law School. His and Diane's relationship had progressed to a point where they were even discussing marriage, and at one point he introduced her as his fiancée, though there had been no proposal. Now, if we were talking about, I don't know, not Ted Bundy, again, not Ted Bundy, then you'd probably be thinking that this is a man with intentions, someone who wants to solidify a future with their beloved. But no, even though I said this is hypothetically not Ted Bundy, we are in fact talking about Ted Bundy, and so that was not his plan. In January of 1974, Ted abruptly cut off all contact with Diane. He wouldn't return her phone calls or her letters, and when she was finally able to make contact with him over the phone a month later, she just wanted answers. Why had he abruptly ended their relationship in such a cruel and callous way? Ted's answer? Diane, I have no idea what you mean. Then he hung up. Savage, I know. That was the last time Diane would ever hear from Ted. The reason why Ted did this? Revenge. Ted Bundy was a petty man. Amongst other things, he was a petty man. She broke up with him back in 1968, so he wanted to repay her in kind. He had plotted this entire reconciliation only to break up with her in this exact way. Now, of course, this is a savage thing to do, but in retrospect, Diane had a lucky escape. At this point, Ted had begun skipping his classes at UPS Law School, and by April, he just stopped showing up entirely. He was out. It was also at this point that several young women had begun to disappear. No correlation, of course. Okay, let's be real. For those that are watching this, listening to this, consuming this content in whichever way, you likely know exactly what Ted Bundy did and who he became. My estimation is that the two most pivotal relationships in Ted's life were with two women, the first being his mother, and the second being with Diane Edwards. Let's go back to Ted's mother. He was raised to believe that she was his sister, and when he did ultimately learn that that wasn't the case, that completely shattered any trust between them. He grew resentful, he grew angry, he grew hateful. And those feelings were only solidified when it came to his relationship with Diane. She ended the relationship, and that absolutely devastated Ted. Similarly to his mother, her lies devastated Ted. So all of this led to him thinking that women were not to be trusted, that women needed to be taught a lesson. On the 4th of January 1974, approximately close to the time when he had ended his relationship with Diane, Ted entered the basement apartment that belonged to 18-year-old Karen Sparks. Karen was both a dancer and a student at University of Washington. She was sleeping in her bed when Ted broke into her apartment. He bludgeoned her in the head with a metal rod and sexually assaulted her with that same rod. She was unconscious in the hospital for 10 days. Thankfully, she did survive, although she was left with physical disabilities. The sexual assault with the metal rod left her with extensive internal injuries, and she was left permanently altered. There aren't enough words to describe just how detestable Ted was, and so I'm not going to try. It didn't take long for Ted to jump from rapist to killer. On the 1st of February 1974, Ted bludgeoned 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy in her bed while she was sleeping. Whilst she was unconscious, he dressed her up in casual clothing and carried her away. Her skull and mandible were later found at Taylor Mountain. Taylor Mountain would become a dump site where Ted would leave the remains of several of his victims. During the first half of 1974, Female college students would disappear at approximately the rate of about one per month, so Ted's kills were as consistent as they were brutal. Ted killed at least 30 women. You know, I say women, but some of his victims were as young as 8 years old. So let's add girls in there too. And these are only the known victims. The reality is, Ted Bundy likely killed many more, and we may never know. Something that Ted enjoyed, for lack of a better term, was returning to the bodies after he had disposed of them and performing sexual acts with the corpses. He would do this until the bodies were so decomposed or had been damaged by wild animals that it was no longer possible to have physical contact with them. Ted decapitated at least a dozen of his victims, and he would keep some of their heads in his apartment. Many serial killers love to keep a trophy, and with Ted, he kept the heads. I have no doubt that he experienced great satisfaction just by touching or looking at the heads, reminding him of exactly what he had done. We've spoken about the atrocities that Ted committed with regards to Karen Sparks and Linda Ann Healy, both interactions where the women had initially been sleeping. Now we need to talk about how Ted was able to lure women to him when they were very much so awake. Ted Bundy was regarded as charismatic and handsome. Charismatic, fair enough, I can't speak to it, but maybe he was. Handsome, I don't see it. I don't see it. Maybe you see it, but I don't see it. Regardless of what I think, some people did think he was a bit easy on the eye, and that made him endearing to some women. People tend to find attractive people more approachable than not, and that worked in Ted's favour. That, coupled with him pretending to be injured, allowed him to gain his victims' trust. On the 1st of June 1974, Brenda Carroll Ball, who was 22 years old at the time, had left the Flame Tavern, which was very close to the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. She was last seen talking in the parking lot to a brown-haired man with his arm in a sling. You'll never guess who that man was. Her skull and mandible were also found at Taylor Mountain. Ted Bundy was a smart man. He left minimal incriminating forensic evidence at his crime scenes. This is what allowed him to evade capture for so long, because as women continued to disappear and disappear, fears grew, but the police had nothing. They had no physical evidence. Also, the missing women had very little in common apart from their physical appearances. They were all young, white, with long dark hair, but that wasn't really much to work off of because there was no way to know who this mystery man would target next. During this time, Ted even began working in Olympia as the assistant director for the Seattle Crime Prevention Commission. He even wrote a pamphlet for women on rape prevention. So there's Ted, hiding in plain sight. He also worked at the Department of Emergency Services, which was a government agency involved in the search for missing women. This man loved a bit of irony. With Ted's list of victims being so extensive, you'd be hard-pressed to name his most brutal attack. I do want to cover one that occurred on the 15th of January 1978. At 2:45 a.m, he attacked 21-year-old Margaret Bowman with a piece of firewood as she was sleeping in her bed. He used a nylon stocking to garrote her. Garroting is a means of killing someone by strangulation, typically with wire or cord. In this case, he used a nylon stocking. He then went next door into 20-year-old Lisa Levy's bedroom. He beat her until she was unconscious and strangled her to death. He then tore off her nipple, bit her buttocks, and assaulted her sexually with a bottle. And again, next door, he attacked Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler. He broke Kathy's jaw and lacerated her shoulder. Karen received a concussion, also a broken jaw, a broken finger, and some of her teeth were knocked out. All of these women were attacked in such a short period of time. This only lasted about 15 minutes. It was short and it was frenzied. Depending on where you research, it is generally thought that Ted started killing in 1974, although we can't know that for sure. Regardless, Ted was first arrested in August of 1975, simply for a traffic violation. I say simply because in comparison to what he was in fact guilty of, a traffic violation was nothing. When the police searched his car, however, they found an ice pick, a crowbar, pantyhose with eye holes that had been cut out, and several other questionable items. This aroused a lot of suspicion. Despite his arrest, Ted still managed to escape twice. Twice! It was during one of his escape attempts where he committed the Sorority house murders. The murders that claimed the lives of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, and where he assaulted Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner. Ted's last known murder was that of 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach. This occurred on the 9th of February 1978. She had been abducted from her junior high school in Lake City, Florida. Her skeletal remains were found near Suwannee River State Park, which was 43 miles west of Lake City. Within a week of Kimberly's disappearance, Ted was arrested. He had been found to be driving in a stolen vehicle, and eyewitnesses had identified Ted at Kimberly's school. There was also physical evidence that linked him to 3 other murders, including a mold of the bite marks found in the flesh of the sorority house victims. Ted was as confident as ever, despite having been arrested. He believed that he could beat a guilty verdict, and it is because of that he rejected a plea deal. The deal that had been offered to Ted entailed pleading guilty to killing Lisa Levy, Margaret Bowman, and Kimberly Leach, in exchange for a firm 75-year prison sentence. The reason why prosecutors were open to a deal is that they believed the chances of losing at trial were very high. Initially, Ted did think the plea deal was a good idea because it meant that he could avoid the death penalty. So this was a tactical move. However, when the time came to actually plead guilty, he backed out. He couldn't do it. He couldn't stand up in the front of the whole world and say he was guilty, despite the obvious fact that he was. So he went to trial in Florida, and it began on the 25th of June 1979, specifically for the murders of Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman. This trial was televised, and given that he knew he had lots of eyes on him, Ted made the most of it. He acted up for the cameras and was dramatic. He adored the attention. Nevertheless, and thankfully, he was found guilty on both murder charges and given 2 death sentences by means of the electric chair. On the 7th of January 1980, he also went on trial for killing 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. In the first trial, he acted as his own attorney, but in the second, he allowed his attorneys to represent him, and they decided on an insanity plea. This was really his best shot, the best possible defense. Despite this, and again, thankfully, he was found guilty and received a 3rd death sentence. Now, you'll remember earlier in the video I mentioned that Ted once worked at the Department of Emergency Services. Well, it was there that he met and began dating Carol Ann Boone. She was a twice-divorced mother of 2. During his sentencing, Ted surprised absolutely everyone by calling Carol as a character witness and marrying her while she was on the witness stand. And Carol was convinced of Ted's innocence. She also gave birth to his child, a little girl who he supposedly adored. Her name was Rose. The marriage lasted 6 years before Carol had to reconcile the fact that the man she thought she married, compared to the man she actually did, were not the same person. Despite endless appeals, Ted's last day of execution was on the 17th of January 1989. Before going to what would become his deathbed, Ted gave details of more than 50 women that he had murdered to Washington State Attorney General's chief investigator, Dr. Bob Keppel. And this is exactly why I say we cannot know for certain exactly how many women or people he killed. It has been said that he spent the night before his execution crying and praying, and when he was being led to the death chamber, his face was apparently grey and sullen. His cockiness and alleged charisma gone. Too right. On the 24th of January 1989, 2,000 volts of electricity surged through his body. You could actually see the smoke coming from his right leg. The doctor checked Bundy and declared that Ted Bundy was dead. And lest you not forget, Ted was infamous. Everyone knew his name. And so when people found out he was officially dead, they cheered. There was an immense amount of satisfaction that one of the most notorious killers, serial killers, was no more. I wish I could say that with his death, people's nightmares ended. But I know that's not true. He killed countless women, countless people. He stole their lives before they had a chance to thrive, and those that survived, he left them with emotional and physical scars that I don't know how you heal from. And of course, we have the families, the loved ones, for those that didn't survive. What about them? What about their lives? They have to go on and live without their daughter, their sister, their friend. Where's the justice for them? Thank you to everyone that tuned in to our video. Your attention and time is much appreciated. In particular, thank you to Andrew. Your suggestion is what inspired me to cover Ted Bundy in the first place. So please be sure to leave your suggestions in the comments and I'll be sure to respond. Thank you again and I'll catch you soon. JMC out.